I became a witch hunter because of a potato salad. My grandmother made the best potato salad in Lancaster County. Every church picnic, every funeral dinner, every wedding reception, people would ask specifically if Martha Yoder was bringing her potato salad. She used a secret ingredient that she never told anyone, not even my mother. The secret ingredient was witchcraft. I found out when I was 12. Grandma had suffered a stroke and was dying in the hospital. My mother sent me to her house to collect some belongings, and I went into the basement looking for her good suitcase. Instead, I found shelves lined with glass jars containing things that definitely weren't meant for cooking. Dried herbs I didn't recognize. Liquids that glowed faintly in the dark. Small bones arranged in patterns. A notebook filled with writing that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And in the corner, a clay pot with potato salad written on the side in my grandmother's careful handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a mixture of what looked like ordinary mayo, mustard, and seasonings. But underneath, barely visible, were symbols carved into the bottom of the pot. When I touched one, the mixture began to glow. That's when I understood why everyone loved Grandma's potato salad. She'd been putting a mild happiness spell on it for 40 years. I never told anyone what I found. Grandma died 2 days later, and I helped my mother clean out the house. I made sure to be the one who went through the basement. I broke every jar, burned every herb, and buried the ashes behind the barn. The notebook I kept. Growing up Mennonite in Pennsylvania, you learn early that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who follow God's plan and those who think they can improve on it. Witches fall into the second category. But here's the thing about witch hunting that most people don't understand. It's not about burning women at stakes or drowning them in ponds. Modern witch hunting is a lot more subtle. It's about identification, documentation, and quiet removal before they can do real damage. The church doesn't advertise this work. You won't find supernatural investigator listed in any denominational directory. But every major Christian organization has people like me: Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics. We all have our specialists. I got recruited when I was 19. I'd been attending Goshen College, studying agriculture, and planning to take over my father's farm. But I kept running into problems that normal farming knowledge couldn't explain. Crops that grew too fast in certain fields, livestock that got sick only on specific dates, a neighbor whose vegetable garden produced tomatoes the size of softballs, while everyone else struggled with blight. I started paying attention to patterns. I took soil samples from different farms and tested them not just for nutrients, but for things the Agricultural Extension Office didn't have tests for. I learned to recognize the signs of supernatural interference in natural systems. When someone's corn grows 3 feet overnight, there are only two explanations: genetic modification or witchcraft. And genetic modification leaves different evidence. Brother Samuel found me in the college library one Tuesday evening, reading everything I could find about historical farming practices and folk remedies. He was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who taught theology classes and drove a rusted pickup truck that always seemed to start no matter how cold it got. "David Yoder?" he said, sitting down across from me. "Yes, sir. I understand you've been asking interesting questions about agricultural anomalies." I closed the book I'd been reading, just trying to understand some things I've observed. "Your grandmother was Martha Yoder, wasn't she?" My blood went cold. "Yes, sir. She was a good woman, helped a lot of people over the years. She made excellent potato salad." Brother Samuel smiled. "Among other things, I knew Martha well. She consulted with our organization occasionally." "What organization?" "The Commission for Spiritual Agriculture. We help farming communities deal with problems that fall outside normal agricultural science. Problems like witchcraft, problems like people who use gifts God gave them in ways that might not align with His intended purposes." Brother Samuel pulled out a business card, plain white cardstock with just a phone number. "We could use someone with your observational skills and your family background, someone who understands both farming and the supernatural forces that sometimes affect it." "What would I be doing?" helping people, investigating unusual situations, making sure that communities stay safe and that individuals with unusual abilities are guided toward appropriate uses of their gifts. And if they're not interested in being guided, Brother Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, we help them understand why cooperation is in everyone's best interest. I took the card. The Commission for Spiritual Agriculture turned out to be a joint operation between several Protestant denominations: Mennonites, Amish, Brethren, Quakers, churches with strong agricultural traditions and practical approaches to problem solving. Our job wasn't to hunt witches in the medieval sense. We were more like social workers with specialized training. Most of the people we dealt with weren't evil. They were just using abilities they didn't fully understand in ways that could cause problems for their communities. A farmer whose crops always thrived while his neighbors struggled. A midwife whose patients never had complications. A weather worker who could bring rain during droughts but couldn't always control when it stopped. Usually we could resolve situations with education and guidance. Teach people about the ethical use of their abilities. Help them understand the importance of balance and community harmony. Most were grateful for the guidance, but not all of them. My first solo assignment was Rebecca Schwartz, a Amish woman in Ohio, whose herb garden was producing plants that shouldn't grow in North American soil. Plants that could cure diseases, but also plants that could kill with a single leaf. I spent 2 weeks observing Rebecca's property. She had a green thumb that went beyond natural talent. Her herbs grew in perfectly straight rows, never had pest problems, and bloomed out of season. More concerning, people had started traveling from other states to buy her remedies. When I approached her about it, Rebecca was completely open about what she was doing. "God gave me this gift," she said, showing me through her garden. "Why shouldn't I use it to help people?" "Because some of these plants are dangerous, and because you're drawing attention from people who might not understand what you're doing." "You mean people like you?" "I mean people like government scientists who might want to study your methods, or pharmaceutical companies who might want to mass-produce your remedies, or journalists who might write stories that bring unwanted attention to your community." Rebecca considered this. "What do you want me to do?" "Limit your garden to safe native plants. If people need medical help, refer them to doctors. Use your gift in ways that don't create problems for your neighbors." "And if I refuse?" "Then other people will come to talk to you. People who might not be as understanding about Amish customs and community autonomy." Rebecca agreed to my suggestions. 6 months later, her garden looked like any other Amish herb garden. Her community was grateful that the stream of outsiders had stopped visiting. Rebecca seemed content with using her abilities for small, local needs. Case closed successfully. Not all cases ended that well. My third assignment was Thomas Miller, a Mennonite farmer in Kansas, whose wheat fields produced grain that never spoiled. He'd been selling surplus wheat to commercial buyers, and some food scientist had noticed that products made with Miller's wheat stayed fresh indefinitely. When I approached Thomas about it, he denied that anything unusual was happening. "It's good farming practices," he insisted. "Proper soil management, appropriate crop rotation, careful attention to harvest timing." "Thomas, your wheat from 3 years ago is still fresh. That's not possible through normal farming." "Maybe I'm just a better farmer than most. Maybe you're using methods that could attract federal attention. The FDA is already asking questions about products made with your wheat." Thomas became defensive. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm feeding people. I'm using the gifts God gave me to serve my community." "You're creating products that violate natural law. That's going to bring scrutiny that your community can't handle." "Let them scrutinize. They won't find anything illegal." "They won't find anything legal either. And when they can't explain what they're seeing, they'll start looking for explanations that might not be comfortable for your neighbors." Thomas refused to modify his farming methods. 2 months later, federal agricultural inspectors showed up at his farm. They collected soil samples, interviewed neighbors, and began monitoring his property with surveillance equipment. The situation escalated quickly. Thomas's church elders became concerned about government attention. His neighbors started asking uncomfortable questions. The local newspaper ran a story about miracle wheat that attracted attention from agricultural researchers. Thomas finally called me for help, but by then it was too late for subtle solutions. I had to arrange for his fields to be contaminated with a fungus that would destroy the supernatural properties of his wheat. It looked like a natural blight, but it effectively ended Thomas's ability to produce his enhanced grain. Thomas was angry about losing his crops, but his community was relieved when the government investigators moved on. The situation returned to normal, but Thomas never forgave me for destroying what he saw as God's gift. That's when I learned that witch hunting isn't about good versus evil. It's about managing the intersection between the supernatural and the normal world. Sometimes that means education and guidance. Sometimes it means more direct intervention. Over the next 10 years, I handled maybe 60 cases. Most were simple situations that could be resolved with conversation and community support. But about 1 in 10 required what the commission called active management. I learned to identify different types of supernatural ability. Weather workers who could influence local climate. Plant speakers who could accelerate growth or modify plant characteristics. Animal whisperers who could communicate with livestock and wild animals. Healers whose touch could cure diseases that medicine couldn't treat. I also learned to recognize the signs when someone with supernatural abilities was moving beyond helpful community service into dangerous territory. The healer who started charging money for miracles. The weather worker who began selling drought relief to the highest bidder. The plant speaker who grew crops enhanced with properties that could be addictive or harmful. Most dangerous were the ones who started believing their abilities made them special, who began to see normal people as inferior, who stopped following community guidance and started making their own rules. Those cases required different solutions. I spent a winter in Montana dealing with a weather worker named Sarah, who'd decided that her gift meant she was chosen by God to control climate for the entire region. She'd been preventing snow in some areas while causing blizzards in others, based on her personal judgments about which communities deserved favorable weather. Sarah had convinced herself that she was conducting divine justice. Communities that she judged as morally corrupt received severe weather. Communities that met her standards got mild, favorable conditions. When I approached her about it, Sarah was completely unrepentant. God speaks through the weather, she told me. I'm just his instrument. You're causing crop failures and livestock deaths in communities that haven't done anything wrong. Haven't they? The people in Billings are living sinful lives. The folks in Great Falls have turned away from God. They deserve consequences. You're not qualified to make those judgments. God qualified me when he gave me this gift. Sarah refused to limit her weather manipulation. She'd moved beyond community service into vigilante justice, using supernatural abilities to punish people she disapproved of. That case required active management. I spent 3 weeks learning Sarah's routines and identifying the source of her power. Weather workers usually focus their abilities through physical objects, stones, metal rods, sometimes plants that are sensitive to atmospheric changes. Sarah used a collection of crystals that she kept in a bag around her neck. When she worked weather, she would arrange the crystals in specific patterns and speak words in a language that predated English. I waited until she was alone in her cabin, then approached her directly. Sarah, you need to stop the weather working. I told you before, I'm doing God's work. You're hurting innocent people. There are no innocent people. Everyone needs to face consequences for their choices, including you. I'd brought a hammer and a pair of heavy gloves. While Sarah was distracted by our conversation, I grabbed the crystal bag and smashed every stone inside. The effect was immediate. Sarah screamed and collapsed, clutching her chest. The connection between her and the atmospheric forces she'd been controlling snapped like a broken wire. "You've killed me," she gasped. "I've disconnected you. You'll live, but you won't be able to work weather anymore." Sarah tried to attack me, but she was too weak from the power disconnection. I left her in her cabin and drove away. She recovered physically, but never regained her weather working abilities. 3 months later, weather patterns in Montana returned to normal. That was my first active management case. Over the years, there were others, not many, but enough to teach me that sometimes the only way to protect communities from supernatural threats is to neutralize the threat permanently. Which brings me to Sister Margaret. The assignment came through Brother Samuel on a Thursday in October. I was at home in Pennsylvania helping my father with the harvest when the call came. "We have a situation in Kentucky," Brother Samuel said. "A monastery outside Lexington. The Trappist Sisters of Divine Grace." What kind of situation? They have a new member. Sister Margaret joined the community 6 months ago. Since then, there have been unexplained events on the monastery grounds. What kind of events? Plant growth that defies natural law, animals behaving unusually, reports of lights and sounds that have no apparent source. The other sisters are becoming concerned. Have you tried talking to Sister Margaret? The monastery operates under strict rules of silence. Sister Margaret hasn't spoken to anyone outside the community since she took her vows. So you want me to investigate? We want you to assess the situation and determine appropriate action. If Sister Margaret is using supernatural abilities in ways that threaten community harmony, she needs to be guided toward more appropriate behavior. And if she's not interested in guidance? Brother Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then you'll need to use your judgment about what measures are necessary to protect the other sisters. I understood. Active management, if required. When do I leave? Tomorrow morning. I'll send you the details. The file arrived that evening. Sister Margaret had joined the Trappist Sisters of Divine Grace after spending 2 years at a Methodist seminary in Tennessee. Before that, she'd worked as a botanist for the National Park Service. No criminal background, no history of mental illness, excellent references from her previous employers. But the monastery's reports painted a different picture. Plants in the monastery garden had begun growing at unnatural rates. Vegetables were reaching full size in weeks instead of months. Fruit trees were producing multiple harvests per season. Flowers were blooming out of season and in colors that didn't match their species. The monastery's livestock had started behaving strangely. Cows were giving twice their normal milk production. Chickens were laying eggs every day instead of every few days. The monastery's cat had begun bringing dead animals to Sister Margaret's cell door, arranged in neat patterns. Most disturbing, other sisters reported seeing lights moving through the monastery at night. Soft green lights that followed no predictable pattern. And sounds, chanting in languages they didn't recognize, coming from the chapel when it should have been empty. The Mother Superior had contacted the commission because she was concerned about the spiritual welfare of her community. The other sisters were becoming frightened. Some were requesting transfers to other monasteries. Sister Margaret needed to be evaluated and, if necessary, managed. I packed my equipment and prepared for the drive to Kentucky. Standard investigation kit. Cameras, recording devices, soil testing equipment, and a few specialized items for dealing with plant speakers who might not be cooperative. The Trappist Sisters of Divine Grace operated a working farm and maintained strict rules of silence except during designated prayer times. Visitors were rare and usually limited to family members and church officials. I would be staying in the monastery's guest house and observing Sister Margaret's activities while posing as a representative from the denominational oversight committee. The Mother Superior had been briefed on my real purpose and would provide assistance as needed. The drive to Kentucky took 6 hours. I used the time to review what I knew about plant speakers and consider possible approaches for managing Sister Margaret if she proved to be uncooperative. Plant speakers were usually the most peaceful type of supernatural practitioner. They tended to be nurturing, community-focused individuals who used their abilities to help with farming and gardening. Unlike weather workers or healers, plant speakers rarely developed dangerous delusions of grandeur. But there were exceptions. I'd dealt with one case in Iowa where a plant speaker had begun growing plants that produced hallucinogenic compounds. Another case in Oregon where someone had used plant manipulation to create new species that were invasive and environmentally destructive. The key with plant speakers was to identify the source of their power and understand their motivations. Most could be reasoned with if you approached them correctly. But if Sister Margaret had joined a monastery specifically to hide her activities, if she was using her abilities in ways that could harm the community, then I would need to be prepared for active management. I reached the monastery just before sunset. The Trappist Sisters of Divine Grace occupied a beautiful property in the rolling hills outside Lexington. Old stone buildings surrounded by gardens and farmland, with a chapel that looked like it had been built to last for centuries. Mother Superior Mary Catherine met me at the guest house. She was a woman in her 60s with the kind of calm presence that suggested someone who'd spent decades in religious contemplation. "Brother Samuel briefed me on your purpose here," she said. "I want you to know that we're grateful for your help. The sisters are becoming quite distressed by recent events." "I understand. Can you show me where Sister Margaret spends most of her time?" "She works primarily in the garden. She's taken charge of our vegetable production since joining the community. The results have been remarkable." Mother Superior led me through the monastery grounds as the sun set. The garden was immediately obvious as the source of the problem. Plants that should have been dormant in October were in full bloom. Tomato vines heavy with fruit, though it was too late in the season for tomatoes to ripen. Pumpkins the size of small cars. Apple trees loaded with fruit, despite having already been harvested twice that year. "This is beautiful," I said, "but unnatural." Sister Margaret says she simply has a gift for gardening, but some of the other sisters are beginning to worry that her methods might not be appropriate for our community. Has she explained how she achieves these results? Sister Margaret maintains the rule of silence strictly. She communicates only through written notes when absolutely necessary, but her actions speak quite clearly. I could see what Mother Superior meant. This wasn't just exceptional gardening skill. This was supernatural manipulation of plant growth on a scale that suggested considerable power. I'll need to observe Sister Margaret's activities for a few days before making any determinations. Of course, Sister Margaret begins her garden work each morning at dawn. You're welcome to observe from a respectful distance. That night, I sat in my guest room and prepared for what might turn out to be my most challenging case yet. Plant speakers in religious communities could be particularly difficult to manage because they often believed their abilities were divine gifts that should be used without limitation. If Sister Margaret had convinced herself that God wanted her to transform the monastery's agriculture, she might resist any suggestions that she moderate her activities. And if she refused to cooperate, I would need to decide how far I was willing to go to protect the other sisters. As I settled in for the night, I heard something that made me sit up and pay attention. Singing. Soft, beautiful singing in a language I didn't recognize, coming from the direction of the chapel. But it was well past the time when the sisters would be in communal prayer. I got dressed and walked quietly toward the chapel. The singing continued, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Through the chapel windows, I could see a figure kneeling in front of the altar. Sister Margaret, surrounded by dozens of small plants that glowed with the same green light the other sisters had reported seeing. She was singing to them, and they were responding. That's when I knew this case was going to require active management. I watched Sister Margaret for 3 days before approaching her directly. She maintained the monastery's rule of silence perfectly. During communal meals, she ate without speaking. During prayer services, she participated with appropriate reverence. During work periods, she tended the garden with the focused concentration of someone who genuinely loved plants. But the supernatural activity was impossible to ignore. I documented everything. The tomato plants that grew 6 inches overnight. The apple tree that produced a 3rd harvest in a single season. the herbs that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in any botanical reference. More concerning were the animals. The monastery's chickens followed Sister Margaret around the garden like devoted pets. The milk cows would approach the fence when she walked past, lowing softly as if greeting an old friend. Even wild animals seemed drawn to her presence. Deer would graze peacefully near the garden while she worked, and birds would perch on her shoulders. On the second night, I heard the singing again. This time I got closer. I positioned myself behind a storage shed that gave me a clear view of the chapel windows without being seen from inside. Sister Margaret knelt before the altar, but she wasn't praying in any traditional sense. She had arranged dozens of small potted plants in concentric circles around her. As she sang, the plants responded with their own light, a soft green glow that pulsed in rhythm with her voice. The language she sang in wasn't Latin or any modern language I recognized. It sounded older, more organic, like words that had grown from the earth itself rather than being invented by human minds. The plants weren't just glowing, they were growing. I watched stems lengthen, leaves unfurl, buds open into flowers. The growth was visible to the naked eye, happening far too quickly to be natural. Sister Margaret was accelerating their life cycles through her singing. When the song ended, Sister Margaret carefully moved each plant to different locations around the chapel. Some went on windowsills, others near the altar, a few by the entrance doors. She was decorating the sacred space with living plants that she'd enhanced through supernatural means. That's when I understood the real problem. Sister Margaret wasn't just using her abilities to improve the monastery's agriculture. She was transforming the religious space itself, creating a chapel that combined Christian worship with practices that were definitely not Christian. I needed to talk to her. The next morning, I waited near the garden as Sister Margaret began her daily work. She acknowledged my presence with a polite nod, but continued tending her plants without speaking. "Sister Margaret," I said, "my name is David Yoder. I'm here representing the Denominational Oversight Committee." She looked up from the tomato plants and nodded again, but didn't speak. "I've been observing the remarkable success of your gardening work. The other sisters are very impressed with the results you've achieved." Sister Margaret smiled and returned to her work. "I was hoping we could discuss your methods. Some of the plant growth I've observed seems to exceed what would be possible through conventional gardening techniques." This time, Sister Margaret stopped working and looked at me directly. Her eyes were green, the same shade as the light I'd seen in the chapel. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pencil. She wrote something and handed me the paper. "God has blessed me with gifts for helping plants grow. I use these gifts in service to the community." I read the note and handed it back. "I understand, but some of your results seem to go beyond natural plant growth. The vegetables that are producing multiple harvests, the flowers that are blooming out of season." Sister Margaret wrote another note. "God's creation is more flexible than most people realize. Plants respond to love and attention in remarkable ways. They also respond to supernatural manipulation, and that kind of manipulation can create problems for religious communities." Sister Margaret's expression hardened. She wrote, "Are you accusing me of witchcraft? I'm suggesting that using supernatural abilities in a religious setting, even with good intentions, can create spiritual complications that might not be immediately obvious." Sister Margaret wrote quickly, "My abilities are gifts from God. Using them to help my community is not witchcraft, it's stewardship." That's a theological question that goes beyond my expertise, but I am concerned about the practical implications of what you're doing here. "What practical implications?" The other sisters are becoming frightened. Mother Superior is worried about community harmony. Your plant manipulation is creating results that could attract outside attention. Sister Margaret stood up and brushed dirt off her hands. She wrote, "The other sisters will adjust. People always fear what they don't understand." And if they don't adjust, if some of them request transfers because they're uncomfortable with supernatural activity in their religious community, then they lack faith in God's diverse gifts. I could see that reasoning with Sister Margaret was going to be more difficult than I'd hoped. She'd convinced herself that her abilities were divine gifts that she had not just the right, but the obligation to use without limitation. Sister Margaret, I need you to understand something. Using supernatural abilities in religious settings can create problems that go beyond community discomfort. It can attract attention from people who might not understand what you're doing. It can put your entire community at risk. Sister Margaret wrote, "Who are you really?" I'm someone who helps religious communities deal with supernatural situations. Someone who's seen what happens when people with abilities like yours refuse to use them responsibly. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to help you understand that continuing your current practices could have consequences for everyone here. Sister Margaret crumpled up the paper and walked away. That evening, I met with Mother Superior to discuss my observations. Sister Margaret is definitely using supernatural abilities, I told her. Plant manipulation on a scale that suggests considerable power and experience. Is she dangerous? Not immediately. But she's convinced that her abilities are divine gifts that should be used without restriction. She's not interested in moderating her activities. What do you recommend? That depends on how committed you are to maintaining community harmony. Sister Margaret's activities are going to continue escalating. More supernatural plant growth, more unusual animal behavior, more lights and sounds in the chapel. The other sisters are already requesting transfers. Then you need to decide whether you want to lose multiple community members to accommodate one person's supernatural practices. Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment. What are our options? Option 1. Convince Sister Margaret to voluntarily limit her activities. Focus her abilities on practical agriculture that doesn't create obvious supernatural effects. And if she refuses, Option 2. Ask her to leave the community voluntarily. And if she refuses that as well? Option 3. Active management. What does that involve? Neutralizing her abilities permanently. She would remain physically unharmed, but she wouldn't be able to manipulate plants anymore. Mother Superior looked troubled. That seems rather extreme. Sometimes extreme measures are necessary to protect communities from supernatural threats. Sister Margaret isn't a threat. She's just enthusiastic about her gifts. Enthusiasm can become dangerous when it involves supernatural abilities and religious conviction. People who believe God wants them to use their powers without limitation often escalate their activities until they create serious problems. Have you seen that happen before? Yes, more times than I'd like to remember. Mother Superior asked me to give her time to consider our options. She wanted to pray about the situation and possibly consult with other members of the community leadership. That night, the supernatural activity at the monastery intensified. I was awakened around midnight by sounds coming from outside. Not singing this time, but something else. A low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. I got dressed and went outside to investigate. The entire monastery garden was glowing. Every plant, from the smallest herb to the largest fruit tree, was emanating the same green light I'd seen around Sister Margaret's potted plants. The glow was bright enough to read by, casting everything in an otherworldly illumination. Sister Margaret stood in the center of the garden, arms raised, singing in that ancient language while plants responded to her voice by growing visibly. But this wasn't just accelerated growth. This was transformation. The tomato plants were developing new types of fruit, some golden, others deep purple, shapes that didn't match any known variety. The apple trees were sprouting flowers and fruit simultaneously, creating impossible combinations of spring and autumn on the same branches. Most disturbing, the monastery's chapel was changing. Vines were growing up the stone walls, but not random ivy. These were organized, deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing. The plants were growing in symbolic arrangements that covered the chapel's exterior in a green script I couldn't read. Sister Margaret wasn't just using her abilities to improve the monastery's agriculture. She was transforming the entire religious space into something that combined Christian architecture with botanical elements that definitely weren't Christian. I realized that the situation had moved beyond community discord into active spiritual contamination of a religious site. That required immediate active management. I went back to my room and retrieved my equipment. Standard plant speaker intervention kit, concentrated salt solution, iron shears, a small battery-powered chainsaw, and protective gear. Neutralizing a plant speaker required severing their connection to the vegetation they were manipulating. Usually, that meant destroying the plants they were using to focus their power, or interrupting the ritual activities that maintained their supernatural connection. Sister Margaret's power source was clearly the garden itself. She'd been cultivating and enhancing the plants for months, building up a network of vegetation that she could control through her singing. Breaking that network would end her ability to manipulate plant growth. I approached the garden carefully. Sister Margaret was still singing, still directing the supernatural plant growth with her voice and gestures. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice me approaching. I started with the apple tree. The chainsaw cut through the trunk easily, but the moment the tree fell, Sister Margaret stopped singing and spun around to face me. "Stop," she said, her first spoken words since I'd arrived at the monastery. "I can't let you continue this. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing. I'm protecting this community from supernatural contamination." Sister Margaret's eyes blazed with the same green light that surrounded her plants. "This isn't contamination. This is transformation. This is what God wants for this place. God doesn't want religious communities to be taken over by plant magic." "Plant magic?" Sister Margaret laughed. "You think this is magic? This is nature responding to love and proper understanding. This is creation fulfilling its intended purpose." I moved toward the tomato plants with the chainsaw. Sister Margaret raised her hand, and the vines suddenly grew toward me, reaching out like grasping fingers. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," I said, cutting through the vines as they tried to wrap around my arms. "You're destroying something beautiful, something that could help people." "I'm destroying something that's putting an entire religious community at risk." Sister Margaret began singing again, but this time the song was different. Harder, more commanding. The remaining plants responded aggressively, growing toward me with obvious hostile intent. The tomato vines wrapped around my ankles. The herb garden erupted with thorn-covered stems that reached for my face. Even the grass beneath my feet began growing rapidly, trying to tangle my legs. I had to work faster. I used the chainsaw to cut through the larger plants while using the iron shears on the smaller ones. Iron disrupted the supernatural connection between Sister Margaret and her vegetation, causing the enhanced plants to revert to normal growth patterns. "Stop!" Sister Margaret shouted. "You're killing them!" "They're just plants. They'll grow back normally." "They're not just plants. They're partners in God's creation. They're responding to love and guidance. They're responding to supernatural manipulation. There's a difference." I reached the center of the garden where Sister Margaret had arranged her most powerful plants, a circle of herbs and flowers that she'd been cultivating since joining the monastery. These were clearly the focus of her power, the plants she used to channel her abilities. Sister Margaret threw herself between me and the plants. "I won't let you destroy them." "Move aside, Sister Margaret. This is going to happen whether you cooperate or not." "No." She spread her arms protectively over the plants. The green light around her intensified, and I could feel the supernatural energy radiating from the garden like heat from a fire. "Sister Margaret, you're forcing me to take more direct action." "Good. Maybe then you'll understand that some things are worth protecting. I activated the chainsaw and cut through the plants around Sister Margaret's feet. The moment the iron blade touched the enhanced vegetation, the supernatural light began to fade. Sister Margaret screamed, not just with her voice, but with some deeper sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The scream was echoed by every plant in the garden as their supernatural enhancement dissolved. Sister Margaret collapsed, clutching her chest as the connection between her and the garden network snapped. "You've killed me," she gasped. "I've disconnected you. You'll live, but you won't be able to manipulate plants anymore." Sister Margaret tried to stand but was too weak from the power disconnection. She looked around at the garden, now returned to normal October vegetation. The glowing vines on the chapel walls had withered and fallen away. "They were responding to love," she whispered. "They wanted to grow. They wanted to be more than they were. They were responding to supernatural manipulation, and now they're free to grow naturally. You don't understand. God gave me these gifts to help creation flourish, to show people what's possible when humans work in harmony with nature. God gave you gifts that you chose to use in ways that threatened a religious community. That's not harmony. That's selfishness." Sister Margaret closed her eyes. "I was making something beautiful. You were making something dangerous." I helped Sister Margaret back to her cell and informed Mother Superior that the supernatural activity had been neutralized. Sister Margaret would recover physically, but she would never again be able to manipulate plant growth. The next morning, the monastery's garden looked like any other October garden. The supernatural vegetables had returned to normal size. The out-of-season flowers had closed their blooms. The apple trees stood bare and proper for the season. Sister Margaret requested permission to leave the community. Mother Superior granted her request, and Sister Margaret departed that afternoon without speaking to anyone. I filed my report with Brother Samuel and returned to Pennsylvania. 6 months later, I heard that Sister Margaret had joined a meditation center in California, where she taught classes about mindful gardening and spiritual agriculture. No supernatural plant manipulation, just conventional gardening with an emphasis on emotional connection to growing things. Case closed successfully. But I still think about her sometimes. Sister Margaret genuinely believed that her abilities were divine gifts meant to be used without limitation. She thought she was serving God by transforming the monastery's garden and chapel. In her mind, she was creating something beautiful and beneficial. The problem with supernatural abilities is that good intentions don't prevent dangerous consequences. When someone with plant-speaking gifts decides that God wants them to transform a religious community, the result is usually community discord, spiritual contamination, and outside attention that puts everyone at risk. That's why active management is sometimes necessary. Not because the people we deal with are evil, but because they're powerful enough to cause problems that go beyond their individual choices. And sometimes, protecting communities from supernatural threats requires neutralizing those threats permanently, regardless of the intentions behind them. That should have been the end of Sister Margaret's story. But 3 weeks after I returned to Pennsylvania, Brother Samuel called with disturbing news. "The meditation center in California contacted us," he said. "Sister Margaret is dead." I set down my coffee cup. "What happened?" "Apparent suicide. They found her in their garden early this morning. She'd ingested a mixture of poisonous plants that she'd somehow managed to grow in their greenhouse." Poisonous plants don't grow in California greenhouses by accident. No, they don't. The police investigation found several species that shouldn't exist in North America. Plants that required specific soil conditions and climate control that the meditation center didn't have. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She regained her abilities. That's what we're thinking, but there's more. The investigating officers found a notebook in her room, detailed instructions for plant manipulation, written in her handwriting. The same techniques she was using at the monastery. she was teaching other people. Apparently, the meditation center has been offering classes in spiritual agriculture for months. They have dozens of students who've been learning her methods. Brother Samuel paused. David, we may have a much bigger problem than one plant speaker in a monastery. I drove to California the following week. The Tranquil Meadows Meditation Center occupied 50 acres in Sonoma County, with organic gardens, meditation pavilions, and residential buildings that housed people seeking spiritual enlightenment through connection with nature. The director, Dr. Elena Vasquez, was a former psychology professor who'd founded the center after experiencing what she called a profound spiritual awakening during a camping trip in Yosemite. Sister Margaret was a wonderful addition to our community, Dr. Vasquez told me as she showed me around the property. She had such a deep understanding of plant consciousness and botanical spirituality. Plant consciousness? The idea that plants are sentient beings capable of communication and emotional connection with humans. Sister Margaret could demonstrate remarkable results through her gardening methods. We walked through the meditation center's garden, which looked suspiciously similar to the monastery garden during Sister Margaret's supernatural enhancement period. Vegetables growing beyond their normal size, fruit trees producing multiple harvests, flowers blooming in impossible colors. Dr. Vasquez, some of these results appear to exceed what would be possible through conventional organic farming. Sister Margaret taught us that conventional thinking about agriculture is unnecessarily limited. When you approach plants with love and spiritual openness, they respond in remarkable ways. How many people has she taught these methods to? We have 47 regular students in our spiritual agriculture program. Sister Margaret was training 12 of them as advanced practitioners who could teach others. 47 people learning supernatural plant manipulation from someone who'd been driven to suicide by the loss of her abilities. 12 advanced students who might be developing their own independent powers. The Commission for Spiritual Agriculture had been created to handle individual cases, not widespread supernatural contamination. Can you show me where Sister Margaret died? Dr. Vasquez led me to a greenhouse behind the main buildings. It was filled with plants I didn't recognize, growing in soil that looked darker than normal potting mix, and under lights that cast a greenish tint I'd seen before. Sister Margaret spent most of her time here, developing new varieties of medicinal plants. She was working on herbs that could treat depression and anxiety more effectively than conventional pharmaceuticals. Where did she get the seeds for these plants? She said they were heirloom varieties that had been preserved by spiritual communities for centuries. I examined the plants more closely. Several species that shouldn't exist outside of tropical rainforests, growing in controlled conditions that somehow mimicked their native environments. Others that looked like common herbs, but had leaves and flowers in shapes that didn't match any botanical reference. Sister Margaret hadn't just been teaching conventional plant manipulation, she'd been creating new species. Dr. Vasquez, I need to speak with Sister Margaret's advanced students. Of course, though I should mention that several of them have been experiencing unusual dreams since Sister Margaret's death. What kind of dreams? They describe vivid dreams about plants calling to them, asking for help. Some have reported that their home gardens have begun growing unusually well since the dreams started. The supernatural contamination was spreading. I spent the afternoon interviewing Sister Margaret's students. Most were well-meaning people seeking spiritual connection through gardening. They'd learned basic techniques for encouraging plant growth through meditation and positive intention. But the 12 advanced students were different. They'd been working directly with Sister Margaret to develop what she called botanical communion, the ability to communicate with plants and influence their growth through focused intention and ritualized interaction. Jennifer Walsh, a former nurse from San Francisco, showed me her home garden through photographs on her phone. Tomatoes in December, roses blooming in every color of the spectrum, vegetables that appeared to be entirely new hybrid varieties. Sister Margaret taught us that plants want to evolve, Jennifer explained. They're not limited to their current forms. With proper guidance, they can become whatever they need to be to serve human wellness. Have you noticed any other changes since you started practicing her methods? The plants respond to me more quickly now. Sometimes I don't even need to use the ritual techniques. Just being near them seems to encourage growth. And since Sister Margaret's death, Jennifer looked uncomfortable. The plants have been more active. I've had to harvest my vegetable garden 3 times this week, and some of the flowers have been glowing at night. Marcus Brown, a software engineer who'd been learning advanced botanical communion for 8 months, reported similar experiences. My apartment balcony garden has taken over my entire patio, he said. The vines are growing faster than I can trim them. And yesterday I found mushrooms growing in my bathroom that I definitely didn't plant. Mushrooms in your bathroom? Growing out of the tile grout. Small ones, but they glow the same green color that Sister Margaret's plants used to glow. The supernatural abilities weren't just spreading, they were mutating. Sister Margaret had developed her plant-speaking gifts over years of practice and study. Her students were experiencing compressed development, gaining abilities faster than they could learn to control them. That evening, I called Brother Samuel to report my findings. We're not dealing with 12 people who learned plant manipulation, I told him. We're dealing with 12 people who are developing independent supernatural abilities at an accelerated rate. How accelerated? Marcus Brown has been practicing for 8 months and is already showing signs of uncontrolled plant communication. Jennifer Walsh is creating new plant varieties without conscious intention. Several others report that plants respond to their presence without any deliberate effort on their part. That's not normal development for plant speakers. No, it's not. Something about Sister Margaret's teaching methods is causing rapid advancement of supernatural abilities. Any idea what? I think she was using the greenhouse as a power amplifier. The soil mixture, the specialized lighting, the specific plant varieties, it's all designed to enhance supernatural plant connection. And now her students are continuing to visit the greenhouse. Every day, they think they're honoring Sister Margaret's memory by maintaining her work. Brother Samuel was quiet for a moment. David, this is beyond commission jurisdiction. 12 people with developing supernatural abilities in a location where they're being encouraged to use those abilities without limitation. I know. If this spreads to the broader meditation center community, we could be looking at dozens of people with uncontrolled plant-speaking abilities. Or worse, some of Sister Margaret's advanced students are showing signs of power development that goes beyond normal plant manipulation. What do you mean? Marcus Brown's mushrooms are growing in areas without any organic matter to support them. They're drawing nutrients from sources that shouldn't be able to sustain plant life. That suggests they're manipulating fundamental biological processes, not just accelerating normal plant growth. Which means we need active management on a scale that the Commission isn't equipped to handle. Brother Samuel told me to continue monitoring the situation while he contacted other denominational oversight groups. Apparently, problems of this scope required coordination between multiple religious organizations. 2 days later, Dr. Vasquez called me with urgent news. "Something's wrong with the greenhouse," she said. "The plants are growing out of control." I drove to the meditation center immediately. The greenhouse had been transformed overnight. Plants had grown through the glass roof and were spreading across the meditation center's grounds like botanical wildfire. Vines covered buildings, flowers carpeted pathways, and vegetables were erupting from the ground in areas that had never been cultivated. More disturbing, the plants were moving. Not just growing, but actively moving. Vines reaching toward people, flowers turning to track movement, vegetables shifting position in their growing beds. Sister Margaret's students stood in the center of the supernatural plant explosion, holding hands in a circle and singing in the same ancient language I'd heard Sister Margaret use at the monastery. They were conducting a group plant communication ritual, and the results were beyond anything I'd ever seen. "Dr. Vasquez," I said, "you need to evacuate everyone from the property immediately." "What? Why?" because 12 people with developing supernatural abilities just lost control of their power simultaneously. This entire property is about to become uninhabitable. The plants were responding to the group ritual by growing aggressively in all directions. But unlike Sister Margaret's controlled enhancement of specific vegetation, this was chaotic expansion without any organizing intelligence. Vines were growing through building foundations, disrupting structural integrity. Tree roots were buckling pavement and damaging underground utilities. Flowers were releasing pollen that glowed with the same green light, creating a luminous fog that made breathing difficult. I approached the circle of students carefully. They were deep in the ritual state, eyes closed, singing words that hurt to hear directly. Around them, plants responded to the group energy by growing at visible speed. "Jennifer," I called out. "Marcus, you need to stop the ritual." They didn't respond. The singing continued, and the plant growth accelerated. I pulled out my iron shears and started cutting through the vines that were growing toward the buildings. The moment the iron touched the enhanced vegetation, the supernatural growth in that area stopped. But there was too much area to cover with hand tools. I needed a more comprehensive solution. I called Brother Samuel for emergency assistance. "I need a full active management team at this location immediately." "How full?" "Enough people and equipment to neutralize 12 plant speakers simultaneously." "That's going to take time to coordinate." "I don't have time. The supernatural plant growth is accelerating. If it continues at this rate, it's going to spread beyond the meditation center property." "How far beyond?" I looked at the vines that were already growing over the property fence and spreading into neighboring farmland. "At current growth rate, probably several miles in each direction within hours. We'll mobilize everyone available. Hold the situation as best you can until we arrive." I spent the next 3 hours fighting a war against supernatural vegetation. The iron shears were effective, but slow. I managed to prevent the plant growth from reaching the main road, but I couldn't stop the expansion across agricultural land. More concerning, the plants were beginning to show signs of aggressive behavior. Vines would actively reach for me when I approached with the shears. Flowers would spray pollen directly at my face when I got too close. Even the grass was growing in patterns that seemed designed to trip me. Sister Margaret's students remained locked in their ritual circle, unaware that their group plant communication had turned into botanical chaos. The Commission's emergency response team arrived just before sunset, 6 vehicles carrying 12 specialists trained in supernatural crisis management, plus equipment that I'd never seen before. Brother Samuel coordinated the operation from a mobile command center, while the specialists deployed around the property perimeter with what looked like military-grade hardware. "Concentrated iron solution dispersal system," he explained, as teams prepared large spray tanks. "It neutralizes supernatural plant enhancement over wide areas simultaneously." "Will it hurt the students?" "They'll experience power disconnection shock, but they should survive." The iron solution deployment was immediate and comprehensive. 6 teams sprayed the supernatural vegetation from different angles, creating a cloud of metallic mist that covered the entire property. The effect was dramatic. Plants that had been growing at supernatural speed suddenly stopped. The green glow faded from flowers and leaves. Vines that had been actively moving became still, and Sister Margaret's students collapsed. All 12 of them fell unconscious simultaneously as their connection to the plant network was severed by the iron solution. The sudden disconnection from that much supernatural energy was traumatic for human nervous systems that weren't prepared for it. We transported them to a hospital in San Francisco, where they were treated for what the medical staff described as severe exhaustion and neurological stress. All 12 survived, but none of them ever regained their plant-speaking abilities. Dr. Vasquez closed the Tranquil Meadows Meditation Center permanently. The property was purchased by an agricultural research company that spent 2 years studying the soil contamination and plant mutations that Sister Margaret's work had created. The commission classified the incident as resolved through active management, and I returned to Pennsylvania, But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Sister Margaret had been a botanist who genuinely wanted to help people through enhanced plant cultivation. Her students had been seekers looking for spiritual connection through gardening. None of them had intended to create a supernatural crisis that required emergency intervention. Yet that's exactly what had happened. The problem with supernatural abilities is that good intentions don't prevent dangerous consequences. When someone with plant-speaking gifts decides to teach others without understanding the full implications of what they're sharing, the result can be widespread contamination that puts entire communities at risk. Sister Margaret had convinced herself that her abilities were divine gifts meant to be shared freely. She thought she was helping people develop their own spiritual connection to nature. But supernatural abilities aren't just personal gifts. They're power that can affect other people, other communities, the natural environment itself. Using them responsibly requires understanding consequences that go beyond individual intentions. That's why active management is sometimes necessary on a large scale. Not because the people we deal with are evil, but because they're powerful enough to cause problems that affect many more people than just themselves. A few months later, I got a letter from Jennifer Walsh, one of Sister Margaret's former students. "I still have dreams about plants," she wrote. "Not supernatural communication, just normal dreams about gardening. I miss the connection I felt during the botanical communion sessions, but I understand now that we were dealing with forces we didn't fully comprehend. Thank you for stopping us before someone got seriously hurt." I keep that letter in my desk drawer next to my grandmother's witchcraft notebook. Both documents remind me that supernatural abilities exist, that some people are born with gifts that go beyond normal human capacity, and that those gifts can be used to help people or to create problems that require outside intervention. The difference usually comes down to wisdom, restraint, and willingness to accept guidance from people who understand the broader implications of supernatural power. Sister Margaret had the abilities and the good intentions, but she lacked the wisdom to use her gifts responsibly within a community context. That's why the Commission for Spiritual Agriculture exists. Not to hunt witches in the medieval sense, but to help people with supernatural abilities understand how to use those abilities in ways that serve their communities rather than endangering them. Sometimes that means education and support. Sometimes it means gentle guidance toward more appropriate practices. And sometimes it means active management to protect communities from supernatural threats that the individuals creating those threats don't recognize as dangerous. It's not always satisfying work. You don't always save everyone. You don't always prevent tragic outcomes, but you help maintain the balance between the supernatural and normal worlds. You protect communities from dangers they might not even recognize until it's too late. And occasionally, you prevent someone with good intentions and powerful abilities from accidentally destroying everything they care about. That's worth doing, even when it requires making difficult choices about neutralizing threats that don't see themselves as threatening. Even when it means becoming the kind of person that others might someday need to be protected from. I still live on my father's farm in Pennsylvania. I still help with the harvest every fall. I still attend the same Mennonite church where my grandmother made her famous potato salad for 40 years. But now I also travel around the country, helping religious communities deal with supernatural situations that require specialized knowledge and sometimes specialized intervention. The commission keeps me busy. There are always people discovering abilities they don't understand, communities dealing with problems that don't have normal solutions, situations that require someone who knows the difference between helpful supernatural gifts and dangerous supernatural contamination. I've learned to live with the moral complexity of the work, helping people when possible, managing them when necessary, always trying to make choices that protect the most people from the most harm. It's not perfect justice, but it's the best balance I can find between supernatural freedom and community safety. And that's all any of us can do. Find the best balance we can, make the least harmful choices available, and hope that someone else will do the same when our own choices create problems we can't see. Sometimes the church sends you to kill a witch. Sometimes the witch is waiting for you. And sometimes, everyone involved is just trying to do what they think is right, with the knowledge and abilities they have. The trick is figuring out who needs help, who needs guidance, and who needs to be stopped before they accidentally destroy everything they're trying to protect. I'm still learning how to make those distinctions. But after 15 years of this work, I'm getting better at it. One case at a time.